Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin with Jurassic Magic, and in today's video, I wanted to focus on Yuna, Hope of Spira in the new Final Fantasy set, and I think overall this commander is pretty cool. It is in Selesnya color combination and focuses a little bit on Enchantress, so that part of it's not super unique, but the other parts is pretty unique. But before I dive any further, if you want to support the channel, consider checking out my Patreon link down below in the description. There are a variety of benefits such as deck advice, early access to videos, and much more, but if you do want to join the community, I do have a Discord link down below in the description too. It is free to join as well, where we talk about the new spoilers and just talk about Magic the Gathering in general. And speaking of which, if you are looking at any of these singles that I talk about today that you want to purchase, make sure to use my TCG player affiliate link down below in the description. And so now without further ado, let's talk about Yuna, Hope of Spira, and how we should build around her. Alright, so let's read what this commander does. So Yuna, Hope of Spira for 3 green and a white, so 5 mana total to cast. It's a legendary creature, human cleric. During your turn, Yuna and enchantment creatures you control have trample, lifelink, and ward 2. And at the beginning of your end step, return up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. So this one is pretty cool. It's returning cards from the graveyard to the battlefield that are enchantments. Of course, the downside is the fact that they do get finality counters on them, which means if they would go to the graveyard, they would have to be exiled instead, so it's like a final chance kind of thing, which makes sense because it's called finality for a reason. However, I will say I do like the buff of giving your creatures trample, lifelink, and ward 2 during your turn. It's only your turn, so not on your opponent's turn, so that's the one big downside, but it's not really too bad because if people want to use targeted removal, they will have to pay additional 2 with the ward ability. So overall, I gotta say this commander is pretty awesome. Of course, a lot of people think of Enchantress with Storm, however, this is Enchantress with big giant creatures, which honestly I kind of dig. So what strategy do we want to build around? So first of all, of course, we want to talk about the synergies, talking about ramp and card draw, which is pretty easy to do because we are in green color combination. Then following that, I'm going to talk about a Selfmill theme because of course we're returning enchantment cards from our graveyard to the battlefield, so that is something to note. And lastly, I'll talk about some of the best creatures that are enchantments that you could utilize in the deck. But first, let's talk about some basics. So of course, ramp and card draw are essential in any kind of deck. So let's first talk about ramp, and I feel like the best land that you could include in this deck in a general sense is Nesting Grounds. I wanted to mention this out of the get-go because you could pay 1 and tap it, move a counter from target permanent you control to another target permanent, activate only as a sorcery. So obviously with our creatures entering with finality counters from the graveyard, we could just move those over to our opponent's creatures, and when they die, they exile, and when our creatures die, they don't get exiled. So that's just a little bit of a pro tip. However, going back to ramp and card draw, there are a ton of options that you could consider in the deck. I usually like low CMC ramp options like Nature's Lore, 3 visits, and Rampant Growth. These are efficient, so that way we could get our commander out earlier. And also with card draw, there's a ton of options because we might play a lot of big creatures. I personally like Greater Good because it's an enchantment itself. If we do have it in the graveyard, we could put it back onto the battlefield with a finality counter because it's any enchantment that's in the graveyard we could do that with. So Greater Good is by far one of my favorite card draw options, especially if you're in a big stumpy deck like this. Also, this is an enchantment based deck, so of course there's plenty of options as far as playing an enchantment, getting a card draw, something like Setessan Champion or Eidolon of Blossoms. I like these ones over cards like Enchantress's Presence because it's whenever another enchantment enters the battlefield instead of cast. That is pretty significant considering that some cards are going from the graveyard to the battlefield. Of course, we might be casting enchantments anyways, so Enchantress's Presence, Satyr Enchanter, or even Mesa Enchantress are all great options too. You could also throw in Sithis Harvest Hand because you also gain an additional life, and this one's cheaper compared to the rest. So that is ramp and card draw, but what else do we want to do? Of course, since we're returning cards from the graveyard to the battlefield that are enchantments, we might go into a Selfmill theme, and you're probably thinking to yourself, we don't really have too much options. Well, green actually has a lot of different options as far as Selfmill. I was actually kind of surprised and taken aback. You could use enchantments like Crawling Sensation or Crawling Infestation, mainly because at the beginning of your upkeep you may mill 2 cards and not both of them, and of course they both get a benefits of making insects on the battlefield. By returning creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield with Crawling Infestation, that works very good with our commander, and Crawling Sensation whenever lands are leaving your graveyard, which can come up too. I do also like some one-off spells like Commune with the Gods and Mulch, mainly because you look at a certain amount of cards, you put one of them into your hand and the rest into the graveyard. That is pretty good considering we want to fill it a little bit more. Another Selfmill option I find incredible in this deck is Shigeki Jukai Visionary, mainly because it's an enchantment creature. Not only that, you can return it to its owner's hand, which can get around the finality counters in a away, you reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest into your graveyard. So this acts as a little bit of ramp, and if you channel it away, you can return X target non-legendary cards from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a great synergy piece, especially if we put it into the graveyard, reanimate it with our commander, then we just pay 1 green and tap it, put it to our hand, and then we can repeat the process if we really wanted to. So of course there's card draw, there's ramp, and there's a little bit of a synergy with Selfmill because we want to put cards into our graveyard so that we can reanimate them later. But what kind of cards do we want to reanimate? What I like about this commander, we can return any enchantment from the graveyard to the battlefield. So there's one enchantment that's probably the most auto-include enchantment in this entire deck. Just like Nesting Grounds, it kind of negates the finality counters that we would have on our creatures. However, this one just doesn't put finality counters at all on our creatures when we would return them from the graveyard to the battlefield. So that's why I find Solemnity a menace, because for one, it's a stacks piece against our opponents. If they're playing a counters deck, well, they're not going to get any counters on their creatures. However, it's going to benefit us a lot more because players can't get counters. So if somebody is playing a poison deck, well, sorry about that. Also, counters can't be put on artifact, creatures, enchantments, or lands, and that's the key word, enchantments. So no counters can be put on our enchantments that return from the graveyard to the battlefield. That does include finality counters. So that way, if somebody removes one of our enchantments, it'll just go to the graveyard instead of exile. So definitely the one that you should include in this deck no matter what. Another option you may want to consider is Calyx Guided by Fate. And I know, I already talked about Solemnity, and it doesn't necessarily work with Constellation on this specific card, because whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So that would be negated by Solemnity, but some cases it might be useful if you don't have Solemnity on the battlefield. But the reason why I like this a lot more is the second ability. Whenever it or an enchanted creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may create a token that's a copy of a non-legendary enchantment you control. Do this only once each turn, so that could be quite powerful, making token copies. And honestly, if you do it enough, it could be quite backbreaking for your opponents, surrounding them with a huge amount of enchantments. Also, I will say this does work with cards like Urza's Saga because it is an enchantment land. If you already went through the saga once, you could just return it back to the battlefield and repeat it again. But I would say the best option is getting the best enchantment creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield because they also get the boosted stats of your commander. So something like Soaring Lightbringer can be excellent, mainly because other enchantment creatures you control have flying. Since we're basically only running enchantment creatures besides our commander, we will evade most threats. And whenever you attack, you create a 1/1 White Glimmer enchantment creature token that's tapped and attacking that player, and it also does have flying because of that static ability. So all this for 5 mana or returning it from the graveyard to the battlefield can be pretty huge. I also love Nylea's Colossus. For 7 mana total, it has the Constellation ability. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, double target creature's power and toughness until end of turn, and it has a 6/6 body, so that could be huge. If we put a couple enchantments on the battlefield at the same time, we could keep doubling the power and toughness, and if we have our commander out on the battlefield, that creature that we double the power and toughness of can get all those benefits of trample, lifelink, and ward 2. And of course, if you want a huge acceleration on mana, Nyx Bloom Ancient is incredible. It is quite pricey, around $40. However, it has an amazing effect. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times as much as that mana instead. That is insane. That could definitely help us cast some of the bigger enchantment creatures that might be in our hand. And the last big stompy creature that I wanted to highlight is Nyxborn Behemoth. This is absolutely crazy in this deck. Of course, it'll cost X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of non-creature enchantments you control. It has trample and has a 10/10 body. You could also sacrifice another enchantment by paying 2 mana and it'll gain indestructible, so it's self-built-in protection. Also, not only that, we could sacrifice an enchantment to put into the graveyard and then later reanimate it with our commander. That is some great synergy, all the while having a big giant creature on the battlefield. So of course, having big creatures on the battlefield can help us close out the game, and something we want to go towards because they will gain the benefits off of our commander. However, you may want to consider some of these game closers so that you can simply, well, win the game. One game closer to consider is Starfield of Nyx. This is 5 mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield, so something similar to our commander. However, it's at the beginning of your upkeep, and as long as you control 5 or more enchantments, each non-Nora enchantment you control is a creature in addition to its other types, and has base power and toughness, each equal to the mana value. So that overall is pretty good. That does include Starfield of Nyx, making it a 5/5 creature. And of course, with all the other enchantments on the battlefield, they will become creatures too, and if you have enough of them, you could use a budget alternative, Craterhoof Behemoth, that actually fits well with enchantments with Demolisher Spawn. For 5 and 2 green, it has trample and haste, and whenever it attacks, if there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, other attacking creatures get +4/+4 until end of turn, and it has a 7/7 body. And what's very neat about the synergy with Demolisher Spawn is the fact that most likely we're going to have Delirium active, because because we're in a self-mill theme after all. So simply, if we keep on swinging with Demolisher Spawn, all our creatures are going to get +4/+4 until end of turn, and trample, ward 2, and lifelink if our commander is out on the battlefield. But if you really want to amplify the amount of enchantment creatures on the battlefield, look no further than Legion Loyalty. I gotta say, this card is amazing. It's an enchantment for 8 mana, but remember, if it's in our graveyard, we could just reanimate it with our commander, and it has one very powerful ability that is simple. Creatures you control have Myriad, and that is definitely enough to close out the game, especially if you have cards like Nylea's Colossus, or even Demolisher Spawn. You make 2 additional copies of each of those on the battlefield, tapped and attacking 2 other opponents. You could double so much creatures' power and toughness on the battlefield, and they will also get +4/+4 until end of turn because of Demolisher Spawn. But just as a reminder, the 2 other token copies that enter the battlefield tapped and attacking won't trigger, so that is just something to consider. But you can stack the triggers of having the Myriad resolve first, then giving your creatures +4/+4 with the attack trigger. So overall, this is a pretty powerful card. Again, Legion Loyalty can definitely close out games for sure. Making token copies of just creatures tapped and attacking each other opponent can be huge. But that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video. Again, Yuna, Hope of Spira is an incredible card. I don't believe it's going to be the best Enchantress commander, because I do believe that still belongs to Sithis. However, this kind of goes in the route of big giant stompy enchantment creatures, instead of just going off drawing a bunch of cards with the Enchantress strategy with Sithis. Either way, it seems like a very fun commander. Let me know down below in the comments, what are your thoughts and opinions? Do you plan on building it yourself? Also, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.